I am delighted to be here. This is a return trip for me. I was here once long ago when Richard organized a conference on the senses in medieval times, which then became a special issue of the senses in society. I think it was one of our first special issues, so I'd like to acknowledge that long-standing collaboration. And perhaps I can begin by just saying what I perceive to be the historical significance of this workshop on power, society, and the senses. And I see it as a sign of what I have called the sensory revolution. I think that word revolution should resonate in these chambers. The sensory revolution in the social sciences and humanities bearing fruit. Now, I speak of revolution and not just another turn, because we've had enough turns. Think of, for example, the linguistic turn of the 1960s, where, as part of what has been called a paradigm shift, the model of language enters the humanities and social sciences. And so culture came to be seen as structured like a language, or a text to be read, or a language game. And that was succeeded in the 1980s by the pictorial turn, which was alert to all the ways in which visual communication matters, especially in a civilization of the image, such as we inhabit. And that would, of course, give rise to the whole terrain of visual cultural studies. Then you have the corporeal turn, also of the 1980s. If you're getting a bit dizzy, okay, there's still some more to come. So hold on to your seats, okay? The corporeal turn introduced the paradigm of embodiment into the social sciences and humanities, and people talked of both the mindful body and the embodied mind. And this understanding of the unity of body and mind was a radical breakthrough, according to some. And then in quick succession, you have the affective turn and the sensory turn in the 1990s. And what we refer to by the sensory turn, I want to call it a revolution, is the way in which scholars from across the social sciences, like anthropology in my case, and the humanities, history in Constance's case, started to turn their attention on the senses as both object of study and means of inquiry. So it's partly this idea of we're going to study the senses, but we're also going to use them to sort of as means of inquiry. And that is manifest in, for example, visual anthropology, which uses film and so forth, but many other techniques as well. Now, I want to suggest that the sensory turn was more in the nature of a revolution because of its holism. Instead of sort of the piecemeal approach that each of these other paradigms represented. For example, the problem with the linguistic turn is its verbalism. It's hopelessly committed to the word. The problem with the pictorial turn is its visualism, being equally sort of focused on the image. And as for the corporeal turn, well, it's all very well to speak of the body as a unity, but we have 5, or actually perhaps more like 33 senses. One of the things is the way in which the senses, once you attend to them, introduce a kind of fractal dimension to any study of the body. That in that regard, we need to look at the relations between the senses, and not just the body as a totality. And it's not as though the sensory revolution leaves language behind. Actually, in many cultures, and indeed at different moments in Western history, language was considered a sense, the sixth sense, in fact. And so it's not as though that faculty is outside of sensory studies, it's part of it as well. And in that regard, the most important, I think, contribution of all these social scientists and scholars of humanities converging on the senses is that it breaks up the hegemony of psychology. Okay? Now, I have nothing but scorn for psychology because of the way in which it is oblivious to the social life of the senses, or indeed what Davide has called the political life of sensation. All of that is sort of not present in the laboratory. And so part of this sensory revolution has to do with, liberating the senses from the laboratory and exploring their everyday life, exploring the ways in which they are developed. So the senses are not just information gatherers or drones, like in psychology, and they're not passive either, subordinate to cognition. Rather, sensing we understand to be an active process, and also a moral process. It's really, indeed, the evacuation of morality from psychology that I find especially perturbing, because perception is a moral act, as was well known in the Middle Ages, and we'll be hearing more about that presently. But I think it persists in that regard. We need to recover that perspective, and the paper will show that today. So, my inspiration to go the route of the senses really came from this man, Marshall Mcluhan. I attended a lecture by him in 1979 in the senior common room of Trinity College in Toronto. He was talking about laws of media, about ratios of the senses, and that piqued my interest. It would eventually lead me to go to Papua New Guinea, an oral society, and explore the life of the senses there. Are people in an oral society more ear-minded than us? We're visually minded because of our literacy. Well, it turned out to be a lot more complicated than that, and I'll leave that to one side. Because what I want to focus on today is the work of Constance Classen, one of the principal instigators of the sensory revolution and a co-conspirator of mine over many years. She published Worlds of Sense, exploring the senses in history and across cultures in 1993. In 2014, she came out with a 6-volume set, The Cultural History of the Senses. She was the general director. Richard edited the volume on the Middle Ages, The Cultural History of the Senses in the Middle Ages. I had the privilege, even though I was completely unsuited to do it, of editing the volume on the modern age, on the 20th century. So I dabbled in history for a while. Constance edited the volume on the 19th century. And this is, I think, an important contribution to the sensory history or cultural history of the senses by the domain-based approach, which we'll talk about later. In 2017, she published The Museum of the Senses, Experiencing Art and Collections. And the important element here is that emphasis on experience, not just viewing art, but experiencing art. And also the emphasis on regulation. Indeed, her work is very attentive to the differential use, engagement, and development of the senses, and one of the focuses of that has been, the senses in the museum. And just, sort of by way of example, there is a difference to the use of the senses in the museum. Basically, you're supposed to check your senses along with your umbrella at the entrance, and you can see, but you certainly must not touch. And this is just, one of countless signs that we are confronted with in modernity. I love this illustration. Okay, the guilty pleasure that this man is clearly deriving from touching the donkey is he's very self-conscious, very, very self-conscious, but he couldn't resist the touch. Okay? And so he's actually going against the rules of the museum and experiencing this pleasure. Now, I think that the humor of this, but also the interest of it, is that now it's normal to look and not touch. That normalization of perception, or the regime of the senses in the museum, seems sort of second nature to us. And so that's what underlines the importance of the following investigation into what could be called the sensory politics of the museum. So I'm going to read from Constance's text because it's so beautifully written. She's a wonderful writer. She's practiced writing far more than I. And I think that you will find this very, very absorbing. So let me begin. In 1850, the keeper of the National Gallery in London described the museum as being frequented by, quote, schoolboys eating bread and cheese, and country folk who, quote, drew their chairs round and sat down and seemed to make themselves very comfortable. Orange peel from snacking visitors lay in the corners. Dirt from muddy boots was tracked through the rooms. and puddles resulting from the little accidents that happen with children were constantly visible upon the floors of the place. As for the pictures on the walls, these were coated with dust and smeared with the fingerprints of inquiring gallery goers. Indeed, the tension between the National Gallery as an unfussy place of recreation in which visitors could enjoy themselves at their ease, and as a prim site of regulation in which visitors must learn to exercise tight control over their behavior, played itself out in 19th century debates over the role of the gallery as a public space. Now, the Victorian era witnessed the rise of the public museum as a key social institution in England. While the concept of a public museum seems commonplace today, at the time it appeared almost a contradiction in terms. As lordly edifices containing objects of wealth and distinction, museums and galleries were traditionally conceptualized as elite sites destined for the supposedly cultured gaze and refined sensibilities of the upper classes. As public institutions, however, they were almost like railway stations in their accessibility to people of even the humblest classes and the most unrefined comportment. The question of whether such storehouses of treasures should be exposed to such people in such a free and easy way was a disputed question among the social elite. What made the notion of a public museum acceptable was the argument that the edifying influence of its exhibits would help polish the rough manners and morals of working-class visitors. It might also be imagined that humble gallery goers would be inspired with awe for the august personages associated with the magnificent displays on view, like the road worker in Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, who was so overcome by a procession of, quote, laughing ladies and fine lords in jewels and silks and powder and splendor that he shouted out, "Long live they all," until he absolutely wept with sentiment. This was the desired response in the laboring classes. However, the suspicion lingered that the uneducated masses would be unable to appreciate the riches laid before them in the National Gallery and other museums, and would, in fact, treat with disdain what they little understood and what familiarity had robbed of its aura of prestige. Furthermore, the memory of the brutal regime toppling of the French Revolution still lingered among the English ruling classes, and museums, with their cornucopia of aristocratic finery, struck many as likely targets for working-class rapacity. So, founded in London in 1824, the National Gallery was intended to be a place where people from all classes could see fine art. However, concerns were frequently raised by the art establishment over the extent to which the uncultured working classes could indeed see what lay in front of their eyes in the gallery. Sight, supposedly the most noble of the senses, had never been held to be very developed among the laboring masses, who were deemed to inhabit a world dominated by crude, material impressions. If the National Gallery was intended to be an empire of sight, in which the eye reigned supreme, it was actually inhabited in a more full-bodied way by much of its public. Indeed, it was noted that many people went into the gallery in search of shelter from the rain, or for other non-aesthetic purposes, and not to view the pictures at all. There was hope that this would change over time, and the visual offerings of the gallery become its main attraction. Indeed, Thomas Unwin was asked by a parliamentary commission whether he had, quote, observed any improvement in the character of the visitors with regard to their looking at the pictures. Well, to this question, the novelist Anthony Trollope would have answered in the negative. He stated that the National Gallery was used as, quote, a place of assignation, a shelter from rain, a spot in which to lounge away an idle 10 minutes, a nursery for mothers who are abroad with their infants, and a retirement for urban picnics. It is always clear, he added, that those who are there, 4/5 care nothing for the pictures. Now, working-class visitors could not really be blamed for this lack of interest in what the elite took to be among the finest sights of the kingdom, for Trollope deemed it impossible that those who are doomed to live lives of manual labor should really care for pictures. He was right. The tactile labor of the hand was incompatible with the aesthetic labor of the eye, according to this viewpoint, a viewpoint which conveniently overlooked the fact that the production of art itself, particularly in the days of the old masters, when artists were involved in the preparation of paints and canvases, involved considerable manual exertion. Art is not just an affair of the eye. Now, the presence of loungers in the gallery was not only considered reprehensible in itself, it was also said to interfere with the visual enjoyment of true art enthusiasts, who might find their view of the works blocked by idling bodies. The following description of the typical behavior of an art connoisseur provides an idea of the sensory techniques of supposedly enlightened spectatorship, and confirms Peter de Bola's statement that a pose, a gesture, an attitude could signify visual refinement. The connoisseur, and here I quote, shades his eyes with his hand, okay? And he peers through his closed fist, and puts on a look of unfathomable sagacity. He ejects certain sounds indicative of his wonder, his delight, and his penetration. Okay? And in that regard, the acts of shading of the eyes with the hands and peering through the fist would have emphasized the scrutinizing gaze of the connoisseur, who thereby shielded his sight from intrusive distractions. Now, there were in fact, many obstacles to optimal viewing, and one of those was actually created by the pictures in the National Gallery. This is not the National Gallery, but it gives you the idea. Being crowded together in a manner that is painful to the educated eye. I quote, this crowding was due to a shortage of space, as well as to contemporary display conventions. While in some ways it might have been visually stunning, it was also chaotic and distracting. Those interested in using art to educate the masses, among them Prince Albert, argued for a chronological and systematic arrangement which would enable the most uneducated eye to learn about the progress of art over history. This argument was in line with the 19th century notion of the museum as a provider of eye knowledge for those unable to learn from books. As a mass of floor-to-ceiling images, the galleries of the National Gallery might inspire awe in working-class visitors, but they were unlikely to offer any sort of systematic education, nor were they unlikely to instill a sense of the goodness of orderliness because of this almost chaotic manner in which the images were all piled together, one atop the other, very different from the way in which sort of paintings are distributed in the contemporary gallery. According to 19th century accounts, the National Gallery was a place in which there was not only much to see, but also much to smell. The contemporary obsession with odors, vapors, and miasmas, described so evocatively by Alain Corbin, is evident in the attention to the Victorians paid to the National Gallery atmosphere. It was the paintings which were deemed to suffer the worst effects of the exhalations and emanations of visitors. The scientist Michael Faraday proclaimed that the atmosphere is so charged with miasma and vapors from crowds as to be liable to injure the pictures. Okay, so all of these exhalations were actually endangering the pictures. Such oft-repeated descriptions created an impression of the public as a sodden mass which oozed through the galleries, leaving a trail of slime. And this would be sort of, just that kind of image. Now, the emanations of the masses were also considered off-putting to the more refined patrons of the National Gallery. Wagen stated that such malodors were so great that, in spite of all my love for the pictures, I have more than once been obliged to leave the building. Now, while the lure of the gallery's visual delights was powerful, it could apparently be overcome by the olfactory disgust induced by working-class visitors. Among the worst offenders in this regard, according to Wagon and others, were nursing women and young children. Such persons were depicted as literally dripping with malodorous fluids. Now, the association of women with liquids and odors was long-standing in Western culture, as Constance has explored in The Color of Angels. It marked women as a source of subversive fluidity which threatened social stability. In this case, social stability was associated with the neatly framed and mostly masculine productions on the walls. The puddles left by young children on the floors of the galleries were another affront to the still, structured images, countering the reputed spirituality of the latter with their blatant display of bodily presence, and perhaps prompting visitors to look as closely at the floors as at the walls, so as not to sully their boots. Now, it seems odd to think of an art gallery as the counterpart of a bar, but the two sites were often juxtaposed in the mid-19th century as competing places of working-class recreation. The argument behind this juxtaposition was that, given that working people must have stimulation of some sort during their leisure hours, art was the most harmless and edifying alternative to liquor. Now, there were those who scoffed at the idea, stating of its proponents that it would be amusing, if it were not so sad, to hear men who are old enough to know something of human nature talking as if those who are thirsting for ale would be glad to take doses of art in its place. However, it was just such a sensory exchange, art for ale, that those who supported public galleries as an alternative to public houses hoped to make. In the case of the National Gallery, the opposition was often presented as between the gallery, as a palace of fine art, and the ostentatious liquor shops known as gin palaces. Thus, one promoter of Sunday openings expressed the hope that the innocent recreation of a visit to the National Gallery would supplant the, quote, coarse and sensual enjoyment afforded by the gin palace. Now, the director of the competing South Kensington Museum, later the Victorian Albert, Henry Cole, was actually quick to install gaslight in 1857 to enhance the museum's allure for the working classes and provide an after-dark alternative to the refreshments of the gin palace. The experiment was found to be a great success. Quote, the looks of surprise and pleasure on working-class visitors when they first observe the brilliant lighting inside the museum show what a new, acceptable, and wholesome excitement this evening affords them all. Now, the juxtaposition was not simply one of sight versus taste, however, for Victorian gin palaces had much to offer the eye, as well as the palate. Blazing with gaslight, outfitted in gleaming mahogany, and decorated with mirrors and stained glass, the gin palace was a sight to see, as well as a place to drink. Nonetheless, the discussion surrounding the merits of working-class sites of recreation was generally framed in dualistic terms, which contrasted the virtue of seeing ennobling artworks in public galleries with the vice of drinking stupefying liquors in public houses. Now, what we find, however, is this idea that, for example, taking a party of working-class men around the National Gallery to cultivate their tastes is what you must do if you would really wean the working man from drink. Okay? So you want to lead them on these tours. That's the only way to wean them from the drink. And this extraordinary statement evidences the extent to which supporters of expanding public access to the National Gallery believed in the transformative power of art. But objections to pursuing this tasteful method of social reform arose when the proposal was advanced that museums open on Sundays in order to create more visiting opportunities for working people and thereby compete with the attractions of public houses. There were many politicians who opposed this and sounded alarms. The idea being that once art galleries were allowed to open on Sundays, how can you forbid the opening of the theater and the opera and the music hall, and the dancing saloon, okay? So, sort of it was going to be really a steady slide. Apparently, opening galleries on Sundays would precipitate a sensory slide from the visual heights of art, spectatorship, to the tactile depths of popular dance, perhaps even prostitution. It was further noted that many pubs themselves supported Sunday museum opening for, this is a quote from a pub owner, publican, sightseeing is thirsty work, and departing gallery goers of a certain class could be expected to head into the nearest drinking establishment. Okay, so they were saying, no, open on Sundays, we'll get all that much more clientele. Okay, so they were very much in favor of it. National Gallery visitors did not always wish to wait until they had departed to relieve their thirst and hunger, however. As noted before, oranges were common gallery snacks, and whole meals might be consumed inside the rooms. Thomas Unwin notes of one group of quote, country people who were enjoying a picnic in the gallery that, quote, when I suggested to them the impropriety of such a proceeding in such a place, they were very good-humored, and a lady offered me a glass of gin and wished me to partake of what they had provided. Okay, so join in. Such visitors evidently had no notion that the National Gallery was supposed to serve as a rarefied, dry alternative to the coarse, liquid enjoyments of the gin palace. To their way of seeing, art and gin went very well together. So we come back to now the question of touch, which tends to be the focus of most of these studies of the museum. Do not touch. And while key, I think what we want to realize about what Constance is doing in this paper is first that she's not just looking at touch, but all the senses, and all the senses, how they're regulated, the sensory politics of the museum. And then she comes to touch as well. Now, more than any other sense, touch was at the heart of the project to regulate Victorian gallery goers. Vision might be the avenue of spiritual enlightenment, but touch was the pathway of corporeal restraint. The 19th century was the period in which museum visitors were definitively taught the impropriety of handling exhibits. Previously, such handling had been commonplace. So, prior to really the mid-19th century, handling had been commonplace. Not only curiosities such as unicorn horns and mummies, but also paintings and sculptures were subjected to touch. Often such touching was incidental, as in the frequent event of visitors touching paintings to point out some feature, for which reason canes and umbrellas were generally not permitted in museums. At times, however, artworks were touched to assess their texture or materials, to enjoy the contrast between visual illusion and tactile reality, or to establish a sense of physical connection with the work and its creator. In 1860, Henry Cole remarked of the multitudes visiting the South Kensington Museum, "We have great difficulty in preventing them from expressing the emotions they feel in looking at a picture. They will touch it, and they say, 'Look at the expression,' and the consequence is they scrape off a little bit of the pigment." Now, cutting or chipping off some little remnant of an object also, in some cases, would tickle their fancy. To prevent this, touch had to transition from being the rule in exhibition spaces to being against the rules. As a result, museums established an identity for themselves not only as places for looking, but also as places for not touching, as Fiona Candle nicely puts it. Now, forbidding touch in museums restricted the damage that exhibits could suffer through handling. And indeed, as the number of visitors to museums vastly increased with greater public admittance, such damage increasingly became a matter of concern. At the same time, curators began to prioritize conservation over the social niceties of allowing visitors tactile access. When performed by members of the elite, touch could be regarded as another sensory form of connoisseurship. However, when the greater public touched exhibits, handling became the sign of an impertinent and unruly familiarity. The 18th century German visitor to England, Zacharias von Uffenbach, shuddered at the sight of country folk running here and there, grabbing everything in museums, though he himself regularly touched exhibits as well. Now, teaching visitors not to touch was no easy matter, as what excited visual interest readily excited tactile interest as well. Accounts of visitor behavior in Victorian museums depict members of the public cheerfully engaging in all kinds of tactile encounters with exhibits, alongside the more damaging acts discussed above. Some of these are easy for us to imagine taking place, as when a painting of an appealing child would be patted, or a religious image would receive a devotional touch. Other reasons for touching would only likely not occur to us today. Thomas Unwin, for example, noted of working-class visitors to the National Gallery that if part of a picture looks very dull, they wet their finger, try to bring it out. Now, this intimate and familiar gesture, performed one feels quite spontaneously, indicates how far members of the public were from believing the museum objects were untouchable. As the director of the South Kensington noted, we all know the public is generally becoming very well behaved, and is well behaved. Still, they very much want to touch things. So this was just seen as something you couldn't quite overcome. Now, a range of techniques was employed to aid visitors in keeping their hands off of the exhibits. For example, placing objects out of reach or behind protective railings aimed to make touching physically impossible. Also, signs, such as the ones that we've seen, warn visitors not to touch, or, in the case of one gallery, ask visitors to, quote, touch what you like with the eyes, but do not see with the fingers. This is an interesting, again, form of substitution. This last admonition aimed to convince patrons that eyes were just as good for touching as fingers. In fact, a key element of the 19th century anti-touch campaign was the notion that there was nothing to be gained by touching art, for everything worth knowing could be acquired by looking. This view was upheld by contemporary aesthetic philosophers, who confined the appreciation of art to the visual realm. To touch a picture, from this perspective, was to reduce a work of art to its crude material form and fail to engage with the exalted aesthetic content available only to the eyes. Now, the promoters of picture exhibitions as a means of morally uplifting the downtrodden often describe themselves being moved by the appreciative responses of the poor to art. Could anything be more touching, asks Henrietta Barnett, describing two working girls. Probably she would have thought of them as ghouls as well, when they exclaim this over the beauty of a painting of undying love. Another supporter of public museum going describes seeing working men in the National Gallery, quote, sitting, wondering, and marveling over those fine works, and having no other feeling but that of pleasure or astonishment. They have no notion of destroying them. Okay, now, the idea that working men would enter the National Gallery with the intent of destroying the exhibits might seem odd, but as discussed earlier, fears of working class rage were rampant among the upper classes in the Victorian era. It would have been soothing for them to hear that the civilizing influence of art had done the trick and tamed the supposedly violent impulses of the masses. Well, I should not have believed I could have enjoyed myself so much and been so quiet, Barnett records overhearing a working class visitor say in an exhibition, describing this response as a lesson learned. Quiet, composed, properly disciplined, the ideal museum goer, it was working. And so, in summary, tracing out the different dimensions of the sensory life of the National Gallery and other public museums in Victorian England soon becomes an investigation into the multiple social and political roles of such institutions. From an elite perspective, it is clear that art exhibitions were viewed as a means of refining the, quote, rough tendencies of the working classes and rendering them more amenable to regulation. Robert Peel, the conservative politician who established the first professional police force in 1829, certainly saw the National Gallery as a means by which social unrest could be quieted. He wrote that through the institution, quote, angry and unsocial feelings might be much softened by the effects which the fine arts have ever produced in the minds of men. A soothing effect. though the bodily presence of the working classes was often a source of sensory displeasure for elite gallery goers, the results in terms of a more refined and better regulated public were deemed to be worth the pain. It is harder to hear the voices of working people in such debates because their opinions were rarely solicited or recorded. Yet the accounts that we do have indicate they were as likely to consider the National Gallery a place of full-bodied recreation in which their senses could be exercised, as they were to view it as a space of contemplative visual enlightenment in which their senses should be restrained. Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of this paper, titled, as Richard mentioned, The Senses at the National Gallery. So the senses at the National Gallery, art as sensory recreation and regulation in Victorian England. And it has indeed given us many insights into the sensory politics of the museum. The museum as a moral space designed to inculcate certain approved sensory habits in everyday people. And I would remind you again, the proper way in which for the connoisseur to view the art was like this or like this, eliminating all the distractions of having to suffer the laboring masses in one's midst. So I open the floor for discussion.
Just your last point there. It's interesting that the proper way to view art involves the hands, which thereby keep you from touching.
Okay.
You're doing this, right?
Right. No, it is, and indeed, it is a fascinating thing. I mean, painting involves as much manual dexterity as it involves visual acuity, you could say. So it's equal, and yet it's seen as a visual art. Craft, handicraft, has that touch of the hand, right? And therefore it's demoted radically. It's not individuated the way paintings are, and indeed it's all an affair of the hand and not the eye. But you look at craft, so there's really interesting ways in which this polarity between art and craft, between eye and hand, continues to inform the whole art culture system, where pieces of art, fine art especially, enjoy tremendous sums, and handicrafts are often other museums for not have the same refinement.
Yeah, so thank you. I would like to ask two questions. They are sort of requests for clarification. So the first one is about, you seem to make a claim about the morality when they say that the elites can touch, but the normal public cannot touch the artwork. But you could also see it in a very practical way that is not at all moral. I'm not saying that that's the way the text portrays the thing, because you could just think that, if it's open to the public, it's a huge amount of people going there, each of them sort of touching the painting. If it is the elite, maybe it just sort of reduce a small number of people. So it doesn't have to have a moral argument there, elites versus the populace.
Okay.
The second issue is about sort of the presence of all the senses in this perceptual aesthetical experience that you were describing. Because in the end it seems that only sight and touch actually play a role, because all the others, like smell, taste, and so on, I mean, they are just sort of part of the experience of going to the museum, and allowing that just allows the museum to have more audience to the exhibitions, rather than they being part of contributing to the sensorial experience, right?
Right.
So I'm just thinking whether you think that there is important conceptual distinction to be made there between, the senses as part of the process of going to the museum versus the senses that actually play a role in the sensorial experience of the aesthetic experience.
Okay.
Does it make sense to you?
No, these are very good questions. Very good. And in response to the first one, the extraordinary thing is this idea that objects are more precious than persons. In a way, and they're part of a heritage that must be preserved, and therefore you must sort of banish touch. And indeed, there is a discourse of conservation that grows up at that time. But it was precisely the fact that in the cabinets of curiosities, which are antecedents to the museums, you only had noble visitors. Okay? And so the idea was that, well, it's fine for them to touch. And indeed, if somebody came to your house and didn't handle the exhibit, it would be like them coming to dinner and not having any of the dinner. Okay? It was expected. And so this was the intimacy of the elite. And still today, connoisseurs are allowed to touch, okay? And collectors, but not other people. So, in part, it was this way in which, these objects were objects of interaction. And the idea that you really couldn't get enough information from just viewing them, that has people, at the Ashmolean, for example, hefting things and shaking them and even sort of biting them. And the reason for biting was before Lavoisier, okay, and the whole invention of a chemistry that could analyze using solutions and so forth. The way to find out whether something, what its substance was by chewing it, was by tasting it, which had very unfortunate consequences for many chemists because they tasted things that they should never have put in their mouths. But the point was that chemistry is indeed, a chemical, taste is a chemical sense, and it was a way of knowing. So I want to suggest that, partly, as Constance argues elsewhere, it has to do with ideas of knowing. But the other point that you make is a very interesting. Aren't smell and sound just incidental, not part of the aesthetic experience itself? And that's a very powerful argument, except for that, recently at the National Gallery itself, there was an exhibition called Soundscape, in which they invited 6 sort of sound artists to come and each make a soundtrack to go along with a different painting. Okay? And so now you stand in front of the painting, and you put on the earphones, and one of them was a DJ, and his sort of very digital soundtrack was perfectly with a very impressionist painting. Okay, the sort of the pixelation was acute, and so the idea was that it heightened, okay, the auditory enjoyment of a visual spectacle. There was also Tate Sensorium, in which sort of the designers at Flying Object also took paintings, and they won the Turner Prize for this. And one of them was won by Francis Bacon. And you sit down in a booth in front of the painting, you put on earphones, you taste chocolate, okay, that actually the hints of flavor in it are going to bring out different aspects of the visual, and there's something measuring your pulse, and they give you a printout of what other paintings you should go and see, because they will excite you in a similar manner. Okay, so it's all biodynamic as well. So, this is a trend in a lot of contemporary art, okay, which is to bring the senses back in. There's installation art and so forth. Yet it's absent from our understanding of art, great art, the old masters and so forth of earlier times. But I would just say that if you look at a Rembrandt really close, okay, you see the whorls of paint. It's as tactile as it is visual. And indeed also the darkness of a Rembrandt painting is not just from time, it's also because light was scarce in prior centuries. Okay? And so the darkness was a manifestation of things emerging out of darkness, but also that often you were navigating the world with other senses besides just sight. And finally, colors. Colors are banal for us now. They're just too common. Whereas the task of making colors for the longest while meant that the blue of Mary, or red, cardinal, these were tremendously powerful attractants, and you couldn't help but be drawn to and want to touch them because of the sacral intensity behind them. So what I'm doing is sort of historicizing your question in light of all the other research that Constance has done, and the idea of aesthetic itself. When you go back to Baumgarten in 1750, aesthetic comes from aesthesis, sense experience in the Greek. So it's not just an experience of the visual. Potentially, it's the experience of all the senses. And I think we're seeing that in much contemporary art, but also in the recovery of some of the sensory dimensions of what she calls experiencing art and collection. So those are huge questions, that you put, and really, this paper had to do with the regulation of touch and smell, not so much about sound, but there are all sorts of ways in, what is the evocative power of these things as well?
No. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it seems to me wanting to limit aesthetics only to the visual,
Yeah, sure.
that's a particular movement that actually detracts or doesn't recognize the pan-sensory experience of, in fact, everyday life, and indeed, recreates the hierarchy of the visual as the top of the hierarchy, the rest, and moving down into areas that then are no longer edifying or aesthetic, that I just wanted to comment on that, but I wanted to also comment on how really nicely the paper brings out a kind of ideological through line. In particular, statements about things touching being too familiar, that it creates family relationships, as it were, and the elite or the upper classes are saying, we will edify you, but you don't belong to us. We will surround you, literally surround you. In this illustration here, we don't see who these people are, but I have to admit, though I've been to the National Gallery, not in the 19th century, but I think we can imagine that most of the paintings were of the elite, paid for by the elite, donated or purchased by the National Gallery that way. So it celebrating itself, demonstrating its superiority, its eliteness, its governing presence, to be recognized, but not to be part of the family of those below them. It is, I think, as I say, the paper brought that out really well.
But the senses are hierarchized, okay, and they are all kinds of social values being sort of communicated through their cultivation, and the sensory stereotyping that goes on here is astonishing. And I'm wondering about, what kind of sensory stereotypes are we still cropping up in art that we're just not aware of? We can see this and we can laugh at some of these things. But if we were another 50 years down the line, how would we be laughing at what we accept as normal in a museum? And that just stresses, the historical contingency of sense perception. You can't study it in a laboratory, I'm sorry, okay, where you abstract history, you abstract society, you abstract the interaction of the senses, that you're looking just at sight or what have you. The worst example of all is the theories of J.J. Gibson, the senses considered as perceptual systems, which has often been used to attack some of the positions that we've talked about in terms of the history. And it's just, I think that we have to recognize the sensorium is a historical formation. And only once we do that can we sort of begin to understand the senses in context and some of these ideologies that pervade their use.
And just one little follow-up, but it's so important to, for us, I think, to talk to our colleagues to say sensorium is not synonymous with all the senses. It's this much larger network of interconnections. You can't say sensorium when you mean the human senses as if it were somehow abstracted.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really key point. The network of connections. I like the, a relational approach. Phenomenologists, for whom I have almost as much suspicion as psychologists, will talk about the interrelation of all the senses. Merleau-Ponty being a classic example of this. But the fact is, look at how the senses are regulated here. Okay? Look, but don't touch. And there are many other contexts in which there is sequencing of the senses and so forth that we need to attend to. So, a network of interconnections. The sensorium is not just a mass of all of the senses acting at the same time. Rather, we need to look at the very particular ways in which, for political and other reasons, the senses are sorted out. And you have a male gaze and a female touch, for example, or you have the stinking, the filthy immigrant, the stinking immigrant. What's going on, with this kind of language?
No, it's a very lovely paper, and it reminded me of a lot of things. Like, for instance, historically, to contextualize, we're also talking about a country that hasn't had images for very long, right? England didn't allow the importation of paintings prior to the 1700s. There were laws against that, and it was in the 1768 is when the Royal Academy is formed. So we're talking about a very, very short period of time. I'm thinking about Peter Dewes John Dewes and Peter de Bola's arguments about the education of the eye, where you have a very compressed period of time, right, in which there is a movement from, and even like the development of public viewings and gardens of paintings before the museum, etc. I mean, it's people really don't know what they're doing, and don't really. So that brought me to sort of. I have a lot of questions, but it brought me to sort of wonder. And you mentioned it a little bit. The difference between the difference that there might be. Comparatively between a Protestant culture of viewing and a Catholic culture of viewing. And to give you an example, that, to me, having grown up in a Protestant culture but having a very Catholic background and having traveled home to Italy many times, I was, one of the things that my parents did is, because we were living in Winnipeg and there wasn't that much visual culture available. They would take me to museums in Italy, as you do with a child. And I remember, and the home is Milan, which is where the Last Supper is painted. And so, when I was old enough, they took me to see the Last Supper when we were visiting grandparents. And I was just floored by the fact that the priest had cut out a hole that basically cuts off Christ's feet for a door. Way back when, because you had to have quick access in and out of the chamber, and then you start to pay attention to it, and Italian churches, which were the places of display, are filled with worn out figures, worn out statues, etc. And now publicly they have to sort of, because of the devotional touch. Because it's much more of a multi-sensory, aesthetic experience. It's much more. It's a place where you go and eat, right, and consume and transubstantiate. All these things sort of pack into it in a way in which it seems, from my experience in Protestant cultures, that there's a very different type, precisely because of the iconoclasm, and there's a very different type of relationship to aesthetic culture.
So both the recency of a visual culture in England, but also the iconoclastic tendencies. Is this a Protestant thing?
Right.
Is that what we're seeing here? I think that there are some profound differences in terms of liturgy. I grew up not in the Catholic Church, but in the United Church of Canada, and there you had grape juice
Right, of course, instead of
because
wine.
you didn't want anybody to get the least bit inebriated. And the bread was Wonder Bread, appropriately perhaps. But the point is that this was really something that, there is a curtailment of the senses in Protestant culture. And I think by contrast of the moment of transubstantiation in the Mass, when the body, the bread becomes the body and so forth. And you have tintinnabulations, you have the ringing of bells, you have the sensing of the congregation, and you have all the senses being fused.
And the fact that in Catholic culture you were not allowed to read scripture.
Yeah.
It wasn't until Second Vatican Council that the papacy permitted Catholics as a group to have access to the Bible. Whereas in Protestant culture, it was obviously
That individual relation, not
An
mediated
individual,
relation
right.
to God. So, there's a whole incredibly important religious history that needs to be worked through in this. And in other chapters of the Museum of the Senses, Constance's 2017 book, she looks at relics. Again, she looks at some of the continuities that way. And indeed, that's important. So,
There's some provocative statement that some of us medievalists are, really on edge about wanting to talk to you about. But we're at 10:30, so once again, thank you so much.